Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today is Thursday, April 13th, 2023. I'm Dr. Umonja Smalls, Director of Professional Development for Maryland's Department of Health, Developmental Disabilities Administration. We welcome you to today's Rate Review Advisory Group meeting. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few things about the webinar. One, all participants are in listen-only mode. There are two options to hear the webinar: by computer and phone. If you look at the panel interface to your right, labeled audio, you can click either computer or phone to switch for the best option. We will be recording the webinar and posting this session on the YouTube and DDA website. Today's PowerPoint has also been uploaded as an attachment and is available to you to download in the webinar panel box along with today's agenda. Questions can be typed in the question or chat box in the webinar panel, and the team will review and respond as appropriate. And now I'd like to introduce Jen McElvain to begin today's meeting. Good afternoon, Jen.
All right, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to our April RBAG meeting. Glad to see all of you here today. Can we go to the next slide, please? All right, so for today's agenda, we're going to start with approval of the March meeting minutes, provide a status update of our March meeting action items. We'll have a general ledger process update from Hilltop, and then we'll continue our deeper look at our FY25 rate review priorities. And then we'll close with some time for open discussion, and then next steps, including what you can expect for our May 18th meeting. We go to the next slide, please. Right. As a reminder, this advisory group is part of the structure implemented to further NDH's commitment to the development of adequate and sustainable rates that promote the vision and mission of the DDA. The commitment members have made to participate ensures an open and transparent process to review rates. We go to the next slide, please. All right. So our REG members were sent an email with meeting minutes on April 6th. As chair, I will make a motion to approve the minutes. Would a member like to second?
I'll second.
All right, thank you. Any comments on the minutes? All right, then since the motion has been made and seconded, let's put it to a vote. All in favor of approving the minutes from our March meeting?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, and we have approved our minutes. Thank you. So now we're going to go to some policy updates. So I will turn it over to Robert.
Great, thank you, Jennifer, and good afternoon, everyone. Happy April. We have a few updates related to the Employment First work group. The LTSS Transition Survey has been released to providers. That survey will close on Wednesday of next week, April 19th at 11:59 p.m. The DDA will review those results and share that information with the Employment First Committee, and then they will determine next steps related to any specific recommendations. And so that's really the only update today related to policy, and I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Jennifer to talk about the status of the action items from our March meeting, unless there's any questions. Okay, great, thank you. Jennifer?
Can we go to the, okay, there we go, the right slide. So these are some of the topics and status updates from our March meeting. The first item was incorporating feedback for the general ledger data collection template, and those updates will be shared by Hilltop in their portion of the meeting in just a few minutes. Another action item was sharing the updated general ledger data collection tool for the FY25 rate cycle, and that was distributed to members by email on April 6th. We were asked for clarification on waiver questions resulting from a memo that MDH sent out. And those questions will either have been or will be answered, but in a separate venue from the RRAG. Our next item, we were going to follow up with the Division of Cost Accounting and Reimbursement about the general ledger template taking the place of cost reports until providers are fully transitioned to LTSS. So Robert, can you provide us with an update on that?
Yes, absolutely. So we've had several conversations with DCAR related to using the GL data collection tool as a replacement for the cost reports that are required if you're billing in PCIS 2. So they've sent us some feedback. They've listed kind of the elements that they would be looking for. And so our next step internally is to kind of do a crosswalk between what they're looking for and the GL data collection tool to see if that information is in there. I do know that there's at least one tab that would need to be added, and that's related to attendance. As you all know, if you're billing in PCIS 2, you're recording attendance in that system. But other than that, we're going to look to see if those other elements are in there, and hopefully we'll be able to share that feedback either prior to the next RRAG meeting or during the next RRAG meeting.
Thank you, Robert. And our final action item was sharing the appendix document with RRAG members, and that was emailed out on April 6th. So now I am going to turn it over to the Hilltop Institute for the latest updates on the general ledger data collection process.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. It's Kristen Deal with Hilltop. We can have the next slide, please. Great. So just some quick updates on our ongoing progress with the general ledger data collection template. As you recall, during the March RRAG meeting, we reviewed the general ledger template development process, engaged in review and discussion about the draft template, and requested additional feedback from the RRAG and stakeholders to support two key issues. One, assisting with finalizing the general ledger template data collection tool, and two, to help identify specific technical assistance needs for implementing the template for data collection starting on July 1st of 2023 in order to be able to capture and collect data for fiscal year 24. And so just kind of go through some of the key highlights. I know we've talked about this in the past, but it really has been an engaged development process, starting early on with engaged discussions with our fiscal and rate setting subject matter experts, along with our colleagues at CBIZ Optimist to identify the data points and the level of detail that would be required to support a rate rebase process. We convened a DDA provider pilot work group from November through January to review the general ledger and submit data, allowing them to identify questions for clarification, provide us feedback, and suggested edits on the template and the process. As a reminder, the work group included 16 providers who self-selected into the group. 7 of those providers submitted data on the template back to us, and 5 of those who submitted data provided us with additional feedback. Solicitation on feedback from the RRAG was also engaged at 2 key points in the process. We reached out with the draft prior to the commencement of the provider work group, and then again prior to the March RRAG meeting, and then we had our discussion in March. Okay, next slide, please. So,
Christine.
Hilltop, go ahead.
Sorry, it's Chris Parks. Just a quick question for you. Of the 7 providers that provided data, how many of them were actually able to put it into the template, you know, kind of full blown, not just lumping it in one spot?
So all 7 providers did put data into the template. I would say probably 4 or 5 of them completed it as the template was designed, and then others lumped it, you know, by a group of service or identified, you know, other ways that they had input the data.
Thank you.
Sure. And so we did want to kind of highlight that following our call in March, our meeting, we did receive feedback from 3 providers and Max on the updated template that was shared. And we wanted to just share some of the comments and suggestions and feedback and the key areas that they were focused around. So we did, number 1 was instructions. So Hilltop received general comments to include more detail and clarity in the instructions, requests for additional details related to completing the template, including specific examples and frequently asked questions. These will all be incorporated into an instruction document that will accompany the template. So we have taken this feedback and expanded the level of detail and information. So hopefully we'll help to address those comments. There was some input on the cost categories. So we had several suggestions related to improving the cost category guidance by including additional examples and revisions for clarification. Some examples of these feedback included where to allocate IT expenses, equipment costs, hiring expenses, documentation time, training time, and supervision time. So we are working to, again, expand the cost category guidance and also provide examples so it's very clear to providers and we can standardize those cost categories across the provider network. We also received some feedback related to wages. So this was on the issue of collecting data on billable versus non-billable time. And so as we've discussed as part of the FY25 rate cycle, this is a priority that was identified. So we will be looking at this issue as the RAG examines this year, and we'll update the general ledger template in the future if it's warranted. We received feedback on the template format. So several suggestions were submitted regarding the template format to improve the design. And so we are working with that feedback to ensure the best design possible. I will say we got all sorts of feedback. Some providers wanted to consolidate the tool, and some providers actually requested that we have a separate tab for each service. So we're trying to take all of that along with the feedback we received from our pilot work group who worked with it to adjust the template as needed. Acuity was another issue that was identified. It was noted that this was missing from the template. So currently the rate setting methodology does include some acuity adjustment. It includes the tiered rates. Acuity was not identified as a rate priority for fiscal year 25. Should this become a priority issue in future rate cycles, additional data points can be added to the general ledger as needed. The final key area of guidance we got back was related to cost allocation guidance. Feedback was received regarding guidance on allocation methods. So we will be working to update the instructions, and will include clarification that the general ledger template is intended to collect costs for providing Medicaid services, and then outline approved methods for allocating costs to help standardize data collection. This is something that was also discussed by the work group, provider work group. So we'll be taking those conversations and again, providing additional guidance as included in our instructions document. Next slide, please.
Kristen, I have 2 questions before you go into the next slide.
Sure.
So I'm sorry for the outside noise. The first question is, sorry, I hope you all can hear me. Billable versus non-billable. Am I understanding you correctly that you're not planning on addressing it in the first iteration of the template, but that it may get addressed in a future template?
Yeah, so we will not be collecting data, and I think the way that is being requested in terms of billable versus non-billable wage time. There is the opportunity to add all that non-billable time in the other BRIC categories, and that guidance will be included in the instruction manual. But as the the template that you have seen and will be discussed later for the fiscal 25 priorities has a specific data point to that. And so given the what happens with the cycle this year and decisions that are made, the template will be updated in the future as needed.
Okay, it just seems like I'm not sure I understand why we would want to handle it one way and then have a change. I don't understand why it wouldn't be better to make a decision and be consistent moving forward, particularly in these early years.
So I think that's because we've made a decision to analyze it as an FY25 rate priority, and as Kristen said, you'll be seeing material about that shortly. And based on that analysis, obviously then DDA will make some decisions about how that should be captured going forward. And once those decisions are made, that will then be, what the results of those decisions will be incorporated in the general ledger template. Okay,
well, I think, so my comment about that and the acuity issue is, I think that I don't know that I would agree with it being, pushed out further. I know we have limited time, but, that's been an ongoing discussion. But even if it is pushed out to a future year, I still think that having the data would be beneficial, because providers are going to be collecting data one way, then we're going to go a year and then ask them to do something different. And I feel like, even if it's not discussed until another year out, it's still helpful to have that data for both.
So it is being discussed this year. I think that's what, if you can help me understand that. We are collecting the data this year. We are discussing it this year. And then the results of that will be incorporated in future general ledger data collection tools.
I'm sorry, I heard Kristen's answer to my question to be that the billable versus non-billable time would not be broken out in this template, and acuity would not be addressed in this template. So that's why I was responding that way.
Well, that's accurate, but that doesn't mean we aren't looking at billable versus non-billable. We're just going to be collecting it separately for this year to better understand the issue.
Okay, I feel like I missed something then. So there's going to be a separate data collection for billable versus non-billable that's separate from the template.
Correct. Yep. Yeah, Optimus has been working on the data collection tool that's going to be specific for our FY25 priority areas, so that we can collect that data right away and have that to look at for this cycle. And then the general ledger tool, if needed, will be updated in the future. So we basically have two data tools. We've got the data collection tool that we're using to look at this year's issues. And then we've got our general ledger data collection tool that's going to be what we try to use going forward.
Okay, well, I'm going to defer to others, but I'm not sure I understand how that makes complete sense, but maybe I'm missing something.
I think I've also heard, so I'm hearing two things. I'm hearing, one, these issues need to be addressed quickly. I'm hearing, two, the general ledger data collection tool is going to take some time for providers to adapt. So this is a way to look at these issues that we've been told are critical to the health of the provider community and facilitating that transition to LTSS, while we also at the same time work on the more comprehensive standardized template that we'll be using going forward.
Jennifer, Chris Parks.
Just for clarification, this is Karen. So for the non-billable data collection tool, which will be a separate tool from the general ledger tool, right? Are we collecting that information? That information is going to be collected at the same time? Are we looking at the same period of time that we're going to be using two separate tools to collect data?
So we're going to talk about that data tool right after we finish talking about the general ledger tool. And there is going to be a pretty quick turnaround time for that data collection tool for this rate cycle. But at the same time, we do also need to start working on implementing the larger data collection tool as well, just so that providers can start collecting data in this way for future years.
Jennifer, it's Chris Parks. Quick question for you. I'm trying to follow the logic behind having the billable, non-billable as a separate data collection tool, when in fact, how we gather that or where we gather that within the final GL data collection tool may drive where we classify expenses. And I think to Laura's point, we're going to grab the expenses in a certain format. I know we've got to go through the tool again and look at the guidance that you're providing, but if we don't incorporate that in now, then again, you're going to do it one way this year, one way the next, but yet I think it's an opportunity for us to figure out how to collect not only the hours, but also the wages associated with that billable and non-billable time in the correct categories that we want them to be in. And I think having them disconnected does not really accomplish that for us, and we need it now rather than later. And I guess that was a statement more than a question.
Sure. So I think we've committed to looking at the billable versus non-billable. We haven't reached any conclusions yet because we still need to see the data. So that is why we're going to be collecting data on that issue, and any changes that come as a result of that effort will be incorporated in the general ledger data collection tool in the future. I mean, I think Optimus can speak to more what synergy there might be between the data collection tool that's going to be specific for billable versus non-billable time and the general ledger data collection tool. I know there has been an effort to try to, I guess, not make them as similar as possible and not have people collecting data in one format in one way and another format. There have been efforts to streamline it, but I think what I would ask is, why don't we hear what Optimus says, and then if we still have questions about how the tools fit together and why things are happening in certain orders, we can certainly talk about that in our open discussion.
So this is Steve Schramm from Optimus, and I'll give some background, and then Chris Welch can give a little bit more detail if necessary. The feedback that we've received is capturing the billable versus non-billable time is not a simple or straightforward process, and so it will require a back and forth with the provider community as well as the advisory group. And so what we had said was, in order to make progress, we need to move forward on the GL template, it would take multiple meetings to get feedback on the billable versus non-billable. And so based on feedback from the provider community that the GL needs to be provided, the template, at least 90 days in advance of the beginning of the contract year, we made the decision to fix the GL template based on the feedback that we've received and use the separate data request for this year's rate setting cycle to begin the process of discussing the detail available for billable versus non-billable and the request for the data format.
This is Chris Welch. I just agree with everything Steve said there. I think that was how we're thinking it through. So I think what might be helpful is to say, okay, if we want to capture billable versus non-billable in the general ledger template, how would we go about doing that? What specific categories would we break down? How would we specifically, look at those different things? And like Steve said, that's a discussion that may take a few sessions, a few meetings, a little bit of time to vet through. And in order to kind of keep with the process that we have now for the general ledger template, I think we want to, have what we have available and look at making revisions for the future. The other alternative that we were thinking through is, maybe we can just throw something out there that seems like maybe this will hopefully capture what we're looking for without necessarily going through that vetting process, in which case, that might end up not being something that's reasonable for providers to populate, or that might cause some confusion and we'd have to go back and make edits anyways. So rather than going out there with something now that hasn't really been vetted and then making changes again anyways, we're thinking we'll go with what we have that's vetted, even if it doesn't fully capture everything, and make changes once they've been vetted and ready to go. So the general idea there is that we have that general ledger template is something that would be kind of continuous and ongoing. And then within each rate cycle, we'd be looking at collecting information as quickly as possible that may be specific to address certain issues. And so one of the things that Jennifer was talking about was we want to look at that non-billable versus billable information. And I think Chris Parks mentioned, how do we collect that and how are those pieces going to interact together? And that's really what we want to discuss now so that we're in a good spot for potentially making adjustments down the road to that ongoing general ledger template. Once we know what we want to do, what we need to collect, and how we can collect that in a reasonable way based on the discussion that we're having this cycle.
Hi, this is Scott. I have a suggestion. In order for me to capture billable and non-billable, of course, non-billable is just going to be spread apart across program support and training. At some point, I'm going to have to put an Excel sheet to make sure that all that adds up to the total non-billable. I can't just put some in program support, some in training, and some in DSP wages and hope it adds up to the total. Thus, we could have an additional column that would be, billable, total non-billable, and then still break it out if we need to, into program support and training. I'm going to have to do that anyway. I'm going to have to make sure it all adds up to total wages. So it's just an idea. You could add one more column.
And Scott, this is the kind of feedback that is very helpful. And what the discussion would be during the meeting or two that we would have to discuss what is available, how you would approach it. Let's make certain that we're consistent. This is not something that is going to be resolved in one conversation. And so it needs to show the GL template going forward and then a separate conversation on this.
This is Maria. Can you all hear me? I was gonna just say that, Max did provide some feedback on how to restructure the GL so that it could serve both purposes of, collecting this billable and non-billable time. because it's critical to the rate setting. I mean, if without it, you have inaccurate rates. And so I think it's really, really important to, and it makes sense to leverage, in my opinion, the general ledger template as opposed to creating a whole different tool. I think that's even more confusing and risky and potentially just more prone to error. So Max's recommendation was to leverage an existing tool rather than come up with something completely different with different definitions and different instructions that are confusing. I just think that lends itself to poorer quality data and feedback. And I think the other concern that we have that you're hearing is that this is a really critical issue currently, as you know, for fiscal 24. So it's confusing to us to hear that the general ledger tool isn't going to be used until fiscal 25, but it's not going to include the billable, non-billable time. We want to make sure we're collecting the data that's needed to support the rate setting now and in the future.
So we hear all of you that it is important, which is exactly why we're trying to develop this tool. We want to make sure we do it right, and it's, as Chris said, it's going to take some discussion. So, like I said, we will incorporate the results of what we learn in this rate setting cycle in the future versions of the general ledger collection tool. But we want to make sure we focus on this particular issue and fully understand it first.
So, Jennifer, just to make sure I'm clear, the reason to do it earlier, or separate, sorry, is because the thought is that it will be incorporated into rate recommendations that go forward for the FY25 rates. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. I just wanted to mention, I'm a little worried about the feedback around Acuity, because it sounded like that, maybe I misheard, but that it was like if we decide to look at that, and I do think that having data around Acuity may help drive the decision to look at Acuity. So it almost feels like without the data, it's going to be hard to prove that it needs to be addressed given all the discussions we've had. So that was one comment. And my last comment on this is, I know Kristen said that there was some feedback about collecting all of the data, I guess, collectively for a provider. And I just want to say, while I am all for reducing administrative burden on providers, if we don't collect it by service, we are not going to be able to set adequate rates by service. And we really have to, given the nature of how services are provided, and for each service to really be able to stand alone in a fiscally sound way, because not every provider provides every service. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Kristen, I think you had another slide, if I recall.
Yep, one more slide just to kind of wrap up where our next steps are. And so, as we've talked about before, we're working on our rollout and training plan for the provider community. And as with our last meeting, if there's any additional targeted technical assistance or specific assistance that you think is needed, please feel free to give us that feedback so we can incorporate that into the plan. But as I mentioned, we're working to incorporate all the edits and suggestions. I'm working with DDA to finalize the changes, and we will be providing the information to the community in May. And so as the more information is available, we will begin to reach out and share the updated versions of the documents. I guess, again, flagging that the goal will be to get providers ready to start collecting the data in fiscal 24, which would be starting July 1st, with the intent to collect that data following the end of fiscal 24, so sometime in the fall of calendar year 2024.
Can I just make one comment about the technical assistance, the targeted technical assistance of providers? When individual providers need it, I would just really recommend that that be handled by ideally one and no more than two people centrally located, metaphorically, in this process. So, you know, a lot of times we see if it goes out to the regional offices, providers get different feedback from different regions. So I hope it'll be, you know, again, ideally one or no more than two people who are able to provide that technical assistance.
This is Chris Parks. I would strongly agree with Laura. I think that there is value in having a central point. Consistent guidance is going to give us more consistent data.
Thanks for that feedback. I think the goal will be to have the same individuals providing the technical assistance and responding to ensure that consistency.
Thank you, everyone, for all the feedback. Why don't we transition over now to Optimus, who are going to continue our discussion of our FY25 rate review priorities. I think the way you put it, Laura, earlier was helpful to think about. So these, the reason we are looking at these in the way that we are is so we can potentially make recommendations for changes and budget for FY25 while at the same time we're building the larger general ledger data collection tool. So with that, I will turn it over to Optimus.
Thanks, Jennifer. So we can move to the next slide. And actually, we'll just jump on to the next one after that as well. So this is the summary slide that we had shared in the last meeting. And so this lists out those various topics we're hoping to address in this cycle. So last time we discussed those first 5 topics that kind of have that white background. The idea there is we wanted to have a little bit of time to work through some of those. And we wanted to give you a status update for now. And we've also done some initial analyses on those last 3 topics, the base wage, training, and service adjustment or closures. Those ones are kind of shaded in gray, and that's what we'll share and discuss a little bit more today. So if we move on to the next slide, we can start talking through that a little bit. We had some really helpful feedback from the last meeting. So we've included some changes in the fiscal year 25 data collection template, which we sent out last week with the meeting material. And so we want to work to finalize that template. So, you know, kind of as we were discussing, trying to make sure that, you know, you all have very valuable input, and we want to use that to help make sure that we're collecting information that is, you know, appropriate and meets the needs there of the providers and what we have for those rate considerations. So in there, you'll see that there's 3 tabs that have kind of a red color. Last time we talked about out in the past, there's been some proposals around those topics for transportation, like we've been talking about the non-billable time and potential, you know, different options for the rate structure for dehabilitation. So in that template that was shared, those 3 red tabs, it's 1 tab for each of those topics, and we're really looking for that feedback from the RAG about, you know, how can we collect that information and how can we use it in a meaningful way that appropriately addresses any concerns. So that's really what we're trying to aim for, is to focus on those specific 3 sections there, again highlighted in red, and we want to get as much input as we can so that we can make adjustments before sending out any information there. I'll just move on to the next slide. The goal here is to kind of collectively agree to a proposal to address these identified issues and develop that data collection template where providers can give us that information that we can use to review those proposals. So we need to kind of balance that with the need for any decisions around the rate cycle to be data driven. So we're really looking again for that additional feedback from the RAG on those topics. And in order to kind of make that timely progress, you know, we're talking about these are very important urgent issues and we want to address them for the fiscal year 25. It's really dependent on that input from the RAG and that provider participation so that we can collect that data in a meaningful way and be able to use that. In addition to being able to collect the data, we need to be able to collect a sufficient amount of really good quality data from providers, as we mentioned in the memo that was sent out for the fiscal year 25 draft. So, you know, we don't want to just necessarily send something out that says, you know, what do you guess or think about a certain aspect. We really want to be able to say, you know, these providers really understood the question and they were able to split things out XYZ way, so that we're really having that data-driven approach to making the adjustments there. So I've kind of been walking through that template a little bit there. We'll just pause here. Are there any questions or comments at the moment on that template or the process there?
Chris, this is Maria. The template you're referring to, that's the one that was sent out with the RAG materials on the 6th. Is that the data template you're asking our feedback on?
Yes, I believe so. If DDA can just confirm, but I believe that's what was sent out then.
Chris, it's Chris. Are you able to share that worksheet that you sent? And is there value in maybe just kind of walking through it and hitting the highlights so we're all on the same page with, you know, what we're trying to accomplish there?
I think that would be helpful.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm not sure what capabilities I have on this and what direction the state wants to take there. That's something that, you know, I could kind of walk through a little bit if it's helpful, if that's how we'd like to proceed. But I think the general idea is really just for those 3 main topics where we're talking about that transportation, the non-billable time, and the rate structure, that we're really looking for input. So it's not necessarily a proposal of like, here is the way that we want to move forward. It's really like, here's some of the things we've asked for or talked about in the past, but we're really not sure how to proceed unless we get some RAG feedback. So for example, we could talk about that the structure for the day habilitation service rates. So in the past, we've talked about, you know, what if we were to have a different rate for each number of individuals being served, or if we were to group things differently. So instead of having a group that's, you know, let's say 2 to 5, we had one that's 2 to 3 and another that's 4 to 6 and another that's 7+, anything like that. So we've talked through some various options there in the past with the RAG and have not found any opportunities there that really look like a good path forward. So what we're looking for is information and feedback from the RAG that says, here is what we'd like to propose. We'd like to propose this group size, or we'd like to propose, you know, moving this component out of the rate and having it billed separately, or whatever it is, so that we're getting that feedback of what specifically are we trying to accomplish, and then how can we collect any information that providers can actually, you know, split that in a reasonable way to support any changes there.
Hey,
so
Chris, hold on a
Sure.
second. Let's give Jennifer and or Robert the opportunity to whether or not they want us to share the spreadsheet and walk through it.
I don't have a problem with that. Robert, do you?
No, excuse me. No, not at all.
Yeah, it sounds like it would be helpful.
Okay, now let's figure out the logistics of sharing that spreadsheet. So, Chris, are you able to present?
I think I can. Let me see if I can.
You, the presenter.
Chris, I'm going to make you a presenter, and you should get a request for that transfer.
Okay, yep, I have that. Give me just a moment and I'll get that pulled up and shared.
So just to give some more context while Chris is pulling that up, the 3 red tabs are the topics that we talked through last meeting where we had asked for some feedback. I know that y'all had mentioned that we needed a little more time to think about it and get back to us on that. And the intention of these tabs are really just a structured place where we can collect that feedback and get your thoughts on those topics that we had discussed in detail last time.
So Leslie, just to clarify, so the 3 tabs that kind of says the non-billable time was not, again, was going to be collected in a separate tool, right? So the other 2, transportation and the structure, were those intended to also be separate, or were those intended to be part of the GL tool?
So this is not the GL tool. The 3 tabs are the 3 functional areas where we're asking for feedback from the advisory group. We've provided the tabs to be able to collect it consistently across the participants. The GL template is set based on the pilot group and the feedback group. We are asking for feedback on these 3 areas separate from the GL template.
So let me just do a quick kind of walkthrough on this, and I'm not going to go into all the details. Are you able to see the Excel document that I have pulled up? It's got some instructions on the left.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. And so this is what had been shared. And the idea here is that, consistent with that table that we showed, that there's certain priorities for fiscal year 25 that we're trying to address. We have kind of this instructions tab, and that first number 1 tab there, program support and facility. This is, directly representing those priorities where we're looking to say, okay, here is information that we'd like to collect. We're looking for feedback from the RAG on whether or not we think this would be an appropriate level of information to address this issue, whether this is reasonable for providers to populate in a fair amount of time, and whether we could use this information appropriately to make adjustments. So we're really kind of saying this is how we're trying to collect the data to address that specific topic for program support and facility. So I just want to
Chris,
pause.
I'm going to interrupt you, if I can. This is Scott on billable and non-billable. Question on what would go in non-billable, is everything, or would you still put some of it in program support? The training time and the travel. The definitions have non-billable time and program support.
Sure. So the idea here is that there are, we do have a rubric here at the end, which kind of goes through those. Sorry, this might be an outdated version, but we do have a rubric at the end there that goes through the specifics to help walk through that. And the idea is we want to kind of get a good understanding of where that non-billable and billable split is. So we understand, for example, that maybe in a supervisory capacity, people may have non-billable time, but that supervision is required, and so that would be part of that non-billable, wage time in program support. Versus, for DSP wages, maybe some of their time is just dealing with, various meetings and professional development, whatever that is, that might be maybe not necessarily training, but things that they need to do as part of their job, but aren't really directly providing that service at any given time. So I don't know that I had a perfect answer for you. I think what we're trying to do is get a good understanding of how we can collect this information and try to get a good feel for how we can then use it.
So all non-billable time would go there. All non-billable time, where they're in training, they're on a holiday, all staff wages that we can't bill for would go in that column.
Yes, that would be the idea, is that we'd have that billable time and the non-billable time split out between those.
Okay. Thanks.
And so Chris, this was it looks familiar. It's the document that was sent out on the 6th. And I think what was unclear that this was a separate data collection tool that you're proposing to send out then to the providers, and you're looking for our feedback to see if this is what's needed and if the instructions are clear. Because yeah, I mean, I had a lot of questions when I was looking at this, but I wasn't understanding the purpose either. So is that right? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. And thanks for.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask, is the intention just to collect it for the day hab services, or would it be expanded to the other services?
This one at the present iteration here is specific to rehabilitation. And so we've been trying to do, I think, yeah, hopefully this is a little bit helpful, is that general ledger template is kind of an ongoing process that will just always be in place. And what we have here, this fiscal year 25 data collection template, that would be specific to the priorities that we were addressing this cycle. Just like last cycle, we had information about transportation and about staff ratios. And so our expectation is that kind of as this process goes, every year there might be specific topics that might not be broken out exactly the way that we're looking for, or might be new things that we want to explore. So there might be additional templates kind of each year that address those specific fiscal year's priorities. And that's really what the goal is right now, is what can we do right now to address things kind of as quickly as possible, understanding that we haven't, given providers a couple months to prepare for this, anything like that, which is that kind of long, ongoing general ledger process. This is really more of that kind of quick response process. All right, so are there any other questions or thoughts, comments so far? Looking at that first tab there, we're looking at the program support and facility costs. Okay, I'm going to switch my screen sharing here just a second because I had pulled up an outdated one there, and let me see if I can get that shared correctly here.
Chris, can I just say, I think given that I had, heard from a few people on the RAG, I don't think as Maria said, that people really understood the purpose of this particular document that was sent out. So I think it's going to be hard for people to give feedback in the moment. I think it's helpful. I mean, and if others feel differently, please speak up. I just, I think, we probably need a little time to process once we have like a really good understanding of the intent and any other information that might be helpful to folks.
Yeah, absolutely. We plan on sending this document out so that we can collect the feedback and give you the time to think about it. And like I said, we had, if you need more detail on what we're looking for specifically in the last presentation, we had shared out specifically what we were looking for as far as feedback goes. And we just wanted to provide a place of structure where we could collect that information from the RAG and get that input.
Thanks, Leslie. And one of the things, just now I've got this kind of finalized version that was shared. This is getting into those cost categories defined, and so this is consistent with the general ledger structure where we're trying to, explain where various components might fall. But again, this is all, we're sharing this with the expectation that we're looking for some feedback and some input on how this can be best addressed. So you'll see at the top of this, we have like a goal that we're trying to collect some a little definition of ideal data and how we would plan to use that data. If we go on to the next tab there, the transportation, this talks about the goal is kind of comparing the methodologies. This was something that was proposed in the last cycle, and we had a meeting in September, I believe, talking through this about redistributing transportation costs by staff hour versus by individuals served. And so this gives kind of a just completely made up example here where we might say, okay, here's what we're seeing for DSP hours, and then here's what we're seeing for individual served, and here's how we see those transportation costs break down by different group size. We have heard some feedback in the past that it's difficult to collect information this way. So that's what we're trying to say is, here's something that we've heard is a topic that would like to be addressed. Here's some things that we've kind of talked about in the past or ways that we would like to move forward, but we understand that there are obstacles and complications in doing that. So we're trying to see, is there a way that we can make some adjustments to this so that providers can populate similar information and we can use it maybe a little bit differently than originally expected? Is this something that we need to kind of take a different look at altogether? When we're hearing this feedback, sometimes we'll hear anecdotes about, this provider is, having this experience, and we want to have a good background for what works for everyone. So when we hear that feedback of there's an issue here, we want to say, okay, that's very helpful. How do you know that's an issue, and what data do we have to support that, and can we get kind of a good background of that data across providers to help address that issue? So that's hopefully that helps a little bit. Again, this is not a specific process that is laid out here as much as it is, here's the intent of how we would like to move forward, and we really need that RAG feedback to say how can we, collaborate and partner with the provider community so that we can collect appropriate data to make a decision in any given way around those specific fiscal year 25 priorities. Does that help make a little more sense?
And Chris, I apologize if I missed this. What's the time frame for the feedback on this?
I think, Leslie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the feedback that we were aiming for is by the 17th. So we had shared this a little bit ahead of time, so we have a little bit of time to review. We wanted to make sure that we had the opportunity to talk through it during this meeting, but also, the longer that we have for these runways for feedback periods, the longer it pushes the process back and the harder it is to fit things within the timeline. So I think the goal at the moment is to have that feedback probably by the end of the day on the 17th.
Yeah, I'm just going to say I think it's going to be really tough to make that happen. I mean, we can try for next week, but having 2 business days is just, given that there really wasn't a good understanding of exactly what this document was, it's going to be very difficult to get that back to you by the 17th. I thought
Yeah.
it was for the data I think what I thought what I read was that the GL tool was the 17th. I didn't know this was being included in that.
Yeah, so the fiscal year 25 data collection tool timeline being April 17th, that was the memo that came out with the data collection tool. We are talking about all these topics in the last meeting as well, and I know that it was a lot to process and think about. We had talked about providing the feedback from that, and we just wanted to provide, again, a place of structure where you can provide the feedback from those 3 topics that we discussed in the last meeting. And so although this format is only giving you the 2 business days from today to give us the feedback, ideally we're looking for this information from the last meeting.
I would still suggest that I think to give us a week would be a reasonable time frame.
I would have to agree as well.
Me as well, too. I know we've got a couple RAG members that are on vacation coming up shortly. So the opportunity to get, now that we have gone through it and looked at it, and I know we've got a couple of tabs to look at, but just it would be helpful to have a little bit of time to digest and then give you the feedback rather than such a quick turnaround. And I understand the short time frame on your end.
As always, we defer to MDH and DDA on the timelines.
Why don't we have some internal discussion, and we'll get back to all of you on that by close of business today.
I would like to understand the DS.
Sorry, I think I might have heard a comment, but it wasn't quite clear. I'm not sure if that was just an offhand or if that was a specific question that we wanted to address. So let me know if there's a question there.
Chris, can you go to the next red tab? I think it's non-billable. It's a little hard for me to see.
Sure. Yep. And so what we've put out here, you know,
my question here is, how do we spread that non-billable time? Because now we have training, we have GA, and on the next one you're going to have some ERE. Is that yeah? So I mean, now are we spreading that non-billable? Because you said a minute ago I can dump all my non-billable and non-billable, but now I think by definition it's have to be spread across all those categories. So those two tabs aren't going to line up. And that's why it's helpful if we had another column, billable, and then we spread the non-billable out if we need to.
Sure, yeah, and that gets back to kind of that discussion we were having earlier about, you know, how do we do this within the context of the general ledger template. This is kind of how we had started thinking this through a little bit. And just like you're having those questions, that's where we want to hear that feedback of, you know, this doesn't make sense, or maybe we need to do it this other way. This is really our kind of just starting point to collect that feedback, as Leslie was saying there. So this isn't necessarily something where we're trying to make the argument, this is the way it needs to be done. This is really just kind of maybe more inspirational to say, okay, well, you can't do this because X, Y, and Z, but you can do this other way, which may be more helpful, or this is too confusing this way, and so maybe we should reformat or redescribe it, redefine it another way, or this is inconsistent between ways that we're collecting information. That's exactly the kind of thing that we're looking for, so that we can look to make those changes. So the idea again is that, you know, we hear non-billable time is a topic that is, you know, there's a lot of interest behind that, and we have some different areas that we've kind of talked about a little bit, but never gotten anything where we've been able to get data to support an adjustment there. And so this is where we're looking for that opportunity to address those topics that are important. And we want to find out how can we address those topics. And that's really, you know, kind of the purpose of the RAG, is having that community support and collaboration so that we can use that data and leverage that position to work between the provider community and kind of that DDA more higher level rate setting that's kind of consistent and fair across the board. So this is, it's not really necessarily this is the right answer, but this is, we wanted to give you basically kind of here's one way that it could be looked at so that you can have that as an opportunity to respond and provide feedback and help us you know, look at ways that we can address these issues.
Chris, it's Chris. In the feedback, original feedback on the GL data collection tool that Max provided between this meeting and the prior meeting, there was recommendations of taking the non-billable, and I want to make sure my understanding is correct here. We're looking to get the non-billable wages out of the wage category. In other words, the DSP wage category would essentially be wages for billable services for actual supports to the individuals we serve, along with that total hours of billable time. And that the non-billable wages and hours would then be spread across the appropriate category, which in this case would be program support, training, and transportation. Is that the ultimate goal, what we're trying to do here? And if we're doing it here, why can that not be incorporated into the GL data collection tool in just the instructions? It's just the home where the wages land. My concern, and we expressed it in the feedback, was dumping all the non-billable time into program support or the hours into program support. You're going to get that mismatch. I'm going to have non-billable wages here, and yet I'm going to have non-billable hours spread across program support, transportation, and training. To me, the wages for the non-billable time and the hours associated with them need to be logged or checked in the GL data collection tool in the category where we want them, in the category of the actual cause for the non-billable time. You got examples in program support, you got team meetings, you got training, your supervision piece. And within training, you've got training on nursing care plans, person-centered plans, all the basic training that goes in there. And then obviously transportation is the hours provided that are not billable there. Is my understanding correct in saying that the non-billable wages should be put in the correct category along with the non-billable hours? Is that where we're headed? Because I think anything other than that, you've got a mixed bag of data that you're going to have to dissect, and I don't know how you dissect it.
Yeah, I think the way that you're describing that, I think, is the way that I'm thinking this through as well. So it's going to be a little bit tricky to try to parse all of these pieces out, and there are going to be some kind of gray areas and some nuance there, which we understand will be a little bit difficult. So the idea here is that this is a kind of proposal or starting point. We want to get that feedback around how we can collect this better and making sure that we are getting all the pieces that we need so that it's not necessarily a mixed bag and it's something that we can use consistently across the board. The idea of having this in the general ledger tool is something that I think is very much of interest, but right now we're showing a template, we're getting lots of questions, lots of feedback just immediately. So we didn't want to go throw something out there that's not going to make a lot of sense and cause a lot of confusion for the general ledger tool, which is kind of already in its process. But we wanted to use this as an opportunity to look at how can we address this? Is this going to be an appropriate way to measure these things? Is this going to be reasonable for how providers can collect and distribute this information? And is it reasonable how we use that information to make adjustments? And once we have a good understanding of all those pieces, then we can talk about, okay, now that we have a process here, now can we put this into the general ledger template kind of for ongoing future cycles? But that's really the point now, is to try to get that information and feedback where we say, okay, it doesn't make sense to have this column and these other columns because they're the same thing, or we need to be able to parse out another piece of data that you're not asking for here, anything like that. That's really the idea here, is we're looking for that feedback and that input of how can we collect that information.
I'll follow that up with the conversation we were having earlier with respect to this not be included in the tool that's getting ready to go out. This level of allocation from a financial perspective, just basic accounting perspective, if this is where we land versus where the GL data collection tool is now, that's not only a revision to my GL for this cycle, but it's possibly also a significant revision to my GL for the next cycle. And I think that's what we were trying to avoid.
Well, in fact, Chris, you're making our argument for us. This is not settled ground, and we know that. We want to have this exchange back and forth with you, and it will take time. And so we've received feedback that MDH and DDA has not made progress. And so we do not want to hold up the GL template. We need the GL template to be done, because we will run out of runway and not have the cost reports available to us. So that has to move forward. We understand that this is a very complex issue, and there's a lot of feedback. If this would have been addressed during the pilot group and the feedback process that started early in the year, we may have already gotten to this, but that feedback was not received. And so what we're trying to do is work with what we have available to us now. And we get this is a complex issue and could potentially cause changes to the GL. That's why we need to fix the GL template as it is now, say we're going forward with it, and then use this as a separate conversation, knowing that it may in the future adjust GL reporting, because this is too complex to simply impose upon you all without any feedback and collaborative input from you.
This is Maria. Did you all get our feedback on the 2 weeks ago on the GL template? Because I think that, you know, we did propose something that I think would make more sense. And, you know, it doesn't have to be part of the GL, but it was a separate tab that builds the billable, non-billable time, because we recognized that was not part of the GL, and had a suggestion of how you could structure it that's aligned with the GL. So it doesn't, you know, as opposed to what we are showing here, which is, in my mind, when I saw it, it needs a lot more instruction because I didn't understand, you know, what needed to go where. So rather than reinvent the wheel with a totally different template, that's where I think we were coming from, is to leverage. And so we've already provided that feedback a couple weeks ago. I don't know if you saw it, but was curious if you did see it, what your reaction was to it, and why you have this as an alternative instead.
I'll defer to DDA on what feedback they had received and shared, but I know that you know, this is the opportunity for the entire RAG to provide feedback. And so this is, you know, not necessarily saying that any specific input is the way that we're moving forward, but to collect that information. So I'm not sure that I have seen that specifically, but I'll let DDA respond to whether or not you know, they've addressed that or how they've seen that information. But this is kind of an opportunity to make sure that we do have that input from everybody and that everyone is available to kind of collaborate here.
It was shared with Hilltop right away. We can make sure if you don't have it, Chris, that you have a copy as well, to kind of take as another alternative potential way to look at the data collection for this issue.
I just wanted to add a little bit to this. The table we have on the tab is not what we are proposing to move forward with. It is a launching pad for the conversation and feedback we want to receive from you all. So we just didn't want to give you a blank tab and say, all right, give us ideas, because that would be very difficult to come together with some good feedback. And so this is just one way we were potentially proposing, but we want that feedback from you all and saying, maybe we should look at it this way, or this is how we want to approach the issue instead.
Okay, and Leslie, that's the feedback that we gave 2 weeks ago. It sounds like you all just didn't get that, so.
Yeah, we'll check in and make sure that any of that feedback that we're incorporating here. But yeah, so I think just kind of big picture, we have walked through a bit of this. I don't want to spend much more time going through all the details, because really this is, like we've been saying, this is really just kind of to inspire an opportunity for comments and feedback so that we can make that progress. That's why we've put kind of these goals and ideal data at the top to kind of give an idea of what we're aiming for, rather than a specific, you know, template. That first tab that's in blue there, that program support and facility, this we're thinking hopefully is in a fairly reasonable spot and wouldn't need too much adjustment. But the other 3 tabs that are in red probably would need some significant input in order to be able to kind of, you know, work with the provider community and get that data supported approach in a timely manner to address those topics. So that's really what we're trying to do right now, is having that collaborative effort to address those topics that were priorities for the cycle. I don't know if there's any other specific questions about this tool. I know we had some other material to get through, so if it's okay, I think I'd suggest that we switch the presentation back over to the slides and keep it moving along. But I'll pause there again if there's other questions or comments.
I guess, I don't know, I'm just a little frustrated that we provided feedback. It feels like not clear exactly where it went, or it went to Hilltop, but did it get to the right people, because you all are presenting on this, and and then there's such a short timeline
So-
moving forward.
So
Go ahead.
my understanding was that the feedback was provided was on the general ledger data collection tool, which is why it was immediately sent to Hilltop. But several of you bring up the good point that some of those points of feedback could also be relevant to this tool. So I actually just now shared it with Optimus as well. So they have that as additional suggestions.
Yeah, and we'll be sitting down as well in the near future once we receive all of the additional feedback on the DCT, so we can look at everything collectively at that time to see what makes sense moving forward as far as any revisions or adjustments to the DCT.
Thanks. So if we want to just move on to the next slide, I think that's kind of the last piece around that DCT. And so that draft, like we said, had been distributed. We're looking for that feedback. We had anticipated looking for a Monday, April 17th deadline. We hear your feedback that you're aiming for a week. And I think Jennifer said that that's something we'll meet about internally and provide an update by the end of the day today. So we just wanted to make sure that we're getting that across. We're trying to have that collaborative approach. We're sharing this information so that we can have a discussion about how it can be collected, how it can be used, and how it can address those specific topics. We did have some other pieces of information that we can walk through a little bit today, but again, I'll just have one last pause there for questions, comments around this data collection tool and the process there.
Chris, this is Maria. Question around it. Once we get the feedback to you all, what's your turnaround time for getting this out again and to the providers? Just knowing that we do have a short timeline to try to analyze the data as well and integrate it into the next rate cycle. Do you have an overall timeline you're trying to achieve?
So I think the idea here is, if we kind of work backwards, we're trying to have some rate kind of, let me see if I can think of the right word here, maybe suggestions, proposals in the summer. We want to have opportunity to provide you draft analyses so you can give feedback ahead of that. So we'd look kind of a month earlier. We were hearing that there was a fair amount of time that providers would need to be able to capture and share this information. And we're hearing, there's some timeline for feedback might need to be extended. So it kind of, it depends on all those various factors. If there are things that are very minor tweaks, we just remove a column. That's something that could go out very quickly. If it's a lot more discussion, that may take a little bit longer. I think preliminarily, we were aiming to have something to share with providers around the end of April, but that can be dependent upon, how well we're able to get some feedback and collaborate to get something that can be useful in a quick timeline there. So that is just kind of our preliminary expectation, was aiming for the end of April to share this out with the provider community. But we are hearing lots of feedback on what things need to be considered here, and so that may be subject to change a little bit. So we had looked at the table of the various topics that we wanted to address in various meetings. This is kind of that update on some of the things we had talked about in the last meeting. And then I'll turn it over to Leslie. We can start talking about some of the data and information that we have on the pieces we haven't necessarily addressed yet, like the base wage information. So if we can move it to the next slide, and Leslie, take it away.
Chris. So as promised last time, we did an analysis on the base wage for the rehabilitation services. The BLS code we use for these services is the 211093 code. We have two separate rates for the varying geographic areas. And the original methodology was to back solve for the rest of state wage using the statewide and geographic differential rates that we get from BLS. But in November of 2021, Max had proposed that we build the rate up by member distribution by county. So this proposal was accepted and the base wages have been built up using this methodology since then. And so we know that the current base wage is from May of 2018 BLS data, which we projected forward using inflation and all the COLA adjustments. So that's just like the basic background of where the BLS wages are currently at.
Leslie, when you say you built it up by inflation and COLA increases, just because I'm not sure what you mean by COLA.
So we've always used the May 2018 BLS data to build up the wages by county for the last several years. And then we've applied that inflation percentage. So using CPI trend, and then later on the legislative percentages that have been passed through to start with to create our base wage. It's always been projected forward to the year.
Okay, so that's my question, because I'm concerned about using the percentage increase from the legislature because that does not match up with inflation. So those numbers, that 4% annually was based on an assumption of a 2.1 CPI, and as we know, certainly the last year, we saw much higher inflation. So I would hope that it would be built up using inflation as opposed to the rate increase, because that will inherently undercut that number.
Yeah, and so this is just has been done in the last couple of rate cycles. If we move on to the next slide, we'll talk about a comparison to the updated BLS wages that we can talk through, where there might be some opportunities for feedback on the way that it's being done. Is that okay, Laura?
Sure. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so as you're saying, we wanted to make sure that we compare the most recent BLS wage data, because inevitably if you use old data and you're projecting forward, there's going to be some swings or changes to the starting point. And so what we've done is pulled the most recent available data from BLS, which is the May 2021 BLS numbers for the same service code that we use for day habilitation. And so on screen, you'll see a comparison of the projected base wage that we're currently using in the rate model and compared to what we're seeing in the most recent BLS wage data. So in orange, you'll see the rest of state. On the right in blue, you see geographic differential, and then it's structured as fiscal year 24 rates, what's currently in that rate model, versus what we're seeing in the May 2021 BLS data projected forward to 2024. And so we're seeing that because day 2 to 1, 1 to 1, and small group use the BLS percentile of 75% for the wages, we're seeing that the May 2021 projected to 2014 is coming in about 3% higher than what is in the fiscal year 24 rates for the BLS wages for the starting point. And that's for rest of state. And the same thing can be said for large group at the 90th percentile. For the geographic differential, we're seeing that in the 2 to 1, 1 to 1 small group, it's about a 6% difference. For large group, however, there's a 5% difference in the other direction, which doesn't mean that the wages have decreased. It just means that the rate of growth for those wages are not in the same direction as what we've been using. So I'll pause there because that was a lot of information.
Leslie, is May 2021 the most recent data that's available?
When we had pulled the data for this analysis, that was the most recent year that we were able to find. If there is a more recent year that I'm unaware of, it would not be a very big lift to pull that information and update the analysis. But this is the approach that we're taking to comparing the base wages. The other piece, oh, sorry, go ahead.
So I guess my question is, I mean, it's interesting data, but how does this slide affect where we're going moving forward?
So we're just showing you the initial analysis on how we wanted to look at the base wages. Both of these numbers are the starting points are different. So fiscal year 24 starts in May of 2018 for the BLS data, and then the May 2021 BLS data is the most recent information. Both of them have been projected forward to fiscal year 24, so we can make a comparable comparison. But what we're doing with this information is still under discussion internally. We wanted to share with you the initial results so we could get some thoughts on what direction we feel would be most appropriate to move towards.
So I like to put things in super simple terms, and the way that I look at this, in those first two dollar amounts, the $24.24 versus the $25, that $24.24 is what's in the rates based on old information. If we were to update that information, it would be $25. And so effectively, that's approximately a 3% difference. That would effectively be about a 3% rate increase for those specific services if we were to change this methodology. So that's what we're trying to show is, here's what we've done. We've looked at the new information. Here's how it would impact things. What pieces are we getting right? What things are we potentially missing there? That's kind of how we would look at things, is if we were to replace what's in there with the $24.24 with the $25, being that it's more recent, that would roughly be a 3% increase. Is that appropriate? Are we oversimplifying that? Or what other feedback do we have?
Well, can I just ask one other question? Wouldn't it really be that you would take the May 21, the updated BLS, and then project forward? So it wouldn't just be, for example, in that rest of state 25, wouldn't it be 25 plus whatever the inflation projection would add to it?
Yeah, I apologize if I didn't explain this thoroughly, but what the numbers are showing is the most recent data projected to 2024 so that we can compare to the current numbers that are in the fiscal year 24 rates.
And so Leslie, this is Maria, what was the trend that you used to go from 21? You use the same trend, I'm assuming, to go from 21, the May 21 BLS data from the as the May 2018 BLS data. Are you using the same trends
yes,
to get to the 24 period? Okay.
That's correct. We are using the same trends, just the starting point is different.
Right. Right. And so, and you said CPI, is that the trend that you've historically, you're applying to the May 21 data as well? Or cost of living adjustment? Yeah,
for the last couple years, it's been the cost of living adjustment, which I believe has been 4% usually. In years before that was in place, which I don't remember off the top of my head, I want to say maybe 2018 and perhaps 2019, we used the CPI. So that was roughly around 2%. And then it gets to the same point in 2021 where they both have the same COLA moving forward. But it would have been COLA for anything where it's been legislatively mandated. And then anything before that was just based off of CPI.
Right. So basically the CPI was understated between 18 to 21 is my interpretation of this. It was a little low, which is why you have a 3% differential in rest of state, and in the geo differential, it's a little bit different. But I find it interesting that you have a negative on the large group at the 90th percentile. That seems strange, but it could just be the data.
Sure, yeah, and this is CPI is used as a proxy to estimate, but like you're saying, there can be a difference between what CPI proxy is and what the experience is for this specific wage or for this specific service. And so that negative there, while the rest of them are positive, that one just wasn't increasing as fast in that region as everything else had been increasing. So relatively speaking, it looks a little, looks a little bit lower.
I'm sorry, let me just ask a clarifying question. So the May 2021 BLS data column, that is, I thought that you were saying that was the actual May 2021. No, it's what you built. So say it one more time. The two different numbers.
Yeah, and there's a lot of information that we try to condense onto one slide, so totally understandable. But it's the May 2021 BLS data projected to 2024, so that we can do a apples to apples comparison to the fiscal year 24 starting wage.
Okay. And
sorry, one more question. Just on the COLA, are you using like the SSI COLA? Because that was like close to 8% recently. I mean, it's been pretty high compared to the 2% that you mentioned for the CPI. So is that what you're using? Is those more recent, 8% COLA adjustments to get you to 24? Or what is the trend, I suppose? What is the trend that you're using?
Yeah, I can try to pull up the details. Robert may be able to better speak to which COLAs were being used, but it would be the same one for both of those for the same time periods. I believe there were some 4% and potentially some 8% in there, but I don't recall those off the top of my head. I'll have to look into that, and Robert may be able to better speak to that at the moment.
Okay, or you can follow up. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I had one. I don't know. Somehow I feel like I missed that we switched from using CPI to using cost of living. So I don't know if anybody can say any more about that, why that change was made.
So the idea, in theory, we're looking at prior data and trying to project forward, and usually we'll have some expectations around trend or increases that just happen naturally. And so in the absence of any direction, legislatively speaking, CPI was something that we had put in place. When the legislature began putting in those 4% COLAs, to the best of my understanding, and I can get back on those specific numbers, I'll see if I can pull those up. The transition there was to say, okay, from 2018 to 2019, let's say we had CPI information. When we're looking at, let's say, 22 to 23, there is a COLA increase that was mandated. And so we're using that COLA to get from 22 to 23, but we're still using the CPI to get from 18 to 19, those kinds of things.
So hopefully this is helpful. Those 4% rate increases aren't COLAs. They're rate increases across everything. They are not meant to be a COLA. And they were based on an assumption of a 2.1% CPI increase. And that is obviously didn't. I would really strongly suggest that we should not use the 4% because we are inherently going to continue to underfund. The 4% providers services have lost ground under that 4% rate increase. So the whole intent of this is to get to where the rates are supposed to be. What's a reasonable rate for what we want, and that 4% is not a valid foundation to this. It is what we have had to, it's what we've had. That's all it is.
Okay, I think just because we are quickly running out of time, this is really valuable feedback, but ultimately something that I think MDH and DDA needs to speak to. The trending percentage that we use to compare the BLS wages is the same that was built into the rate model, just so that we can get that on the same level of comparison. But we will take this back and we'll have to probably get back to you unless MDH or DDA has a response right now.
I'll just add to that this is, these are the kinds of things where we're saying, okay, we already have data, so we're going to share with you what the data are telling us right now. And that's really the point of this slide, is we're sharing, this is what the data are telling us right now. And just like we're asking for feedback on the other pieces, this is something where we're sharing with you, here's what the data are telling us, here's how it's initially intending to be used, and looking for feedback on exactly what you're giving us. Maybe this hasn't been considered, maybe that's not appropriate, so on and so forth. And ultimately it's up to DDA and MDH to make those decisions around how that moves forward. But this is really just like the other piece. We're trying to share with you where we are at the moment and ask for that feedback. This type of feedback, since we're not going to be collecting this from providers, isn't something that it's as urgent to get back within the next few days or the next week. But this is an opportunity for you all to provide feedback on and comments there. So it sounds like we should be able to share out some of that kind of trending information for your review. And then if there's other comments, questions, feedback, that's exactly what we're looking for with presenting this preliminary results right now.
Yeah, we'll go back and take a look at that.
If there aren't any other additional initial reactions, we can move on to the next slide. But as Chris said, we will look to send out some more details around our analyses, and then we can have that discussion offline. Okay, so the other piece we talked about updating was the training component. In the rate model currently, we have a staffing level assumed in the rates. So for day habilitation, small and large group, we have a DSP1, which originally was 63 hours in total. For day hab 1-to-1 and 2-to-1, we used the DSP1 with behavior and meds, which had 94 total hours of training. The considerations that we initially had for training was accounting for full-time versus part-time employees, staff replacement hours that would be needed to send somebody to training, turnover rates at the initial versus ongoing hours of training. And so these were all the things that we had originally built into the rate model. It's our understanding that there is currently a training matrix alignment process in the works, and there have been some policy updates on training since we initially built the training into the rate model. And DDA has a draft of the new required hours, but the final version is still under review and awaiting feedback. So we will be looking for a final version to incorporate into the rate model sometime in June, is my understanding. So I just wanted to give you the update on training, as we had committed to talking about it, but we don't have the final hours yet, so there isn't any numbers to share today.
Leslie, can I just ask the considerations for inclusion in rates? How much of this is data that needs to be collected?
So basically, what we're kind of sharing here is that to calculate the training, we're essentially taking those number of hours up top, 63 hours, and dividing that by the number of hours kind of expected to be worked. And the way that we get that denominator of expected to be worked is using that full-time versus part-time, the staff replacement, all that information. So we have that information in the past. I believe it was from the 2019 or 2018 provider wage survey. So that's something where we have a ratio, I think it's roughly, off the top of my head, it's roughly 2/3 full-time and about 1/3 part-time. And I believe the estimates were, an average of about 37 hours per week worked for full-time, and I think about 17 hours per week part-time. And we can share that information if that's helpful. But the idea there is that that information was expected to be relatively consistent. If there are things here that we're looking to make adjustments, that is where we'd be looking for feedback and input. But I think the idea would be essentially keeping that, if there's no reason to make changes to that denominator around expected hours, then we'd be looking to update that 63 hours with whatever the new information is, and use that with the ongoing, support there for those other pieces. So essentially at 63, if that gets bumped up to 80, we'd just move that in the numerator, and that would give a higher percentage in training.
Chris, I have a question. Do you know what the turnover rate expectation was in that formula?
I don't have that off the top of my head, but it is, I know it was fairly high. I think it was around the 40s percentile. But I know that there had been providers that had experienced more turnover than that, and certainly some that had less. And that was kind of the average from the wage survey. But if that's helpful information for us to share out, that's something we could do.
Well, I just think it's significant, because the amount, and I assume my colleagues on the call probably see the same trend, is, you have folks that are in your program as team members, and if they stay 2 years, chances are you're going to have them for 5. But the biggest turnover is, from the date of hire to 6 months. And if you're constantly churning that, as many of us are, unfortunately, you're the first exposure to all of our organizations is sitting through 3 or 4 days of training. And so we just want to make sure that we have good, as best we can. It's not so much your overall turnover rate. It's really more your turnover rate in the first 12 months of employment, which really drives the majority of your training costs. So just something to take into consideration if we haven't, as we look at that.
Yeah, just I think our most recent data, which is a few years old, is that half don't half turnover in a year, half of new DSPs.
Okay, thank you for the helpful feedback, and we can take that back and see if we can share out some of that information if MDH and DDA is comfortable with it, and then consider that additional feedback from when we.
Yeah, I know that we've been on these calls, the last 2 calls, been a lot of conversation about data, a lot of conversation about all these type of things, and I think a little bit of a frustration of just how do we move forward more aggressively, knowing that this is not easy stuff. But that's the type of information, without putting massive requests on providers every month to provide more data. My guess is that's the type of information that we could turn around very, very quickly. That's an email put to my HR department. What's our turnover? 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 120, and if there are pain points there that really need to be considered, which I think there probably are, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, we could get you that actual data, I believe, very, very quickly in our system versus some of the other data requests that require a tremendous amount of work. So just for what it's worth, if that would be helpful, I'm not trying to offer it up for everybody else, but I just think that those are pieces that would not be that difficult to glean out of our system rather quickly.
Absolutely.
That's the #1 priority that all of us are dealing with right now in all of our organizations, is getting team members in here well trained and figuring out how to keep them. and it drives it drives our overtime, all the things that have to do with these additional costs that we're bearing are driven because of, in large measure, because of that one particular metric. So
yeah, absolutely. And that's why we had saved this topic until this meeting, because we know that this data is hopefully more readily available than the more complex stuff that we were trying to tackle earlier on. So we'll take that back in and see what else we can incorporate based on your feedback into this kind of analysis. Are there any?
I have a question. So are you looking then to integrate this kind of data, update it from what you all did before, and that will be integrated into this new data collection tool that you're hoping to release in 2 weeks, the end of April? Is that what you're looking to try to do?
So just because this feedback is coming to us right now, I don't want to misspeak or commit to anything that we haven't thoroughly talked through internally, but we definitely want to consider all the feedback that you gave us on this today and figure out what the best way forward is. We know that the DCT is a lot more complex, but if this is something that, like Greg was mentioning, that we can just get turned around pretty quickly, it might be a simpler option to separate the two requests. But I, again, don't want to commit to anything or make a definite statement around how we want to approach this until we talk about it internally.
Mm-hmm. And I guess I had another question. This, the training ties back to our billable, non-billable discussion earlier. And, what was happening, you just mentioned that there's some updated requirements that are going to be, coming out in several months. And so when we're collecting billable versus non-billable time and how much to allocate to training, is that the history? Or are you looking for what it will look like in the new world? That's, I think, maybe a consideration if there's more training requirements that are going to be imposed, that I suppose needs to be considered versus what has happened historically.
Yeah, and that's the purpose of updating the training component to reflect that change, right? And I understand that they're all intertwined and it's very hard to tease it all out. I don't think we'll ever have a perfect rate where everything is accounted for perfectly, but we're doing our best to incorporate the new information as much as possible as soon as we get it. But that, again, is something that needs to be thoroughly vetted and talked through. So I don't want to make any commitments now, but we are definitely taking all of your feedback and working to figure out how best to incorporate it moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other initial thoughts on the way we are approaching or thinking about approaching the training component? Okay, if not, then next slide, please. But you're always welcome to submit additional feedback afterwards to the RRAG email account. The last piece that we had committed to looking at, which is the service adjustment analysis. So this one is fairly straightforward. This is what is currently being built into the rate model. We had taken 2014 through 2016 closure data, calculated the number of days worked, which we're using 720 days, recognizing that you're not open 365 days a year. And we created a factor of 3.6% to build in for those service adjustments. So that's what was done in the current rate model. On the next slide, we'll have what we've been looking at, which is the closure data for the last 10 years, roughly. And we're seeing a slight difference in the numbers for the 3 overlapping years. And I think that's accounted for potentially the difference in what was defined as a closure. In this table, the number of days of state closures is defined as any days where there was a liberal leave or closure in effect for any county. And so to update this, we would just take the 3 most recent years, which would add up to 32 days, for instance, divided by that 720 days to get a roughly 4.4% new closure factor. And the years that we're choosing is definitely up for debate and still being decided on, but that's just an example of what we could do to update the service adjustment factor. I know we're running short on time, but are there any initial thoughts, comments?
Leslie,
Just throw in there. Sorry, I'll just throw out there that the opportunity for feedback is not, just this last couple minutes, but any of these things, we want to make sure you have time to understand, digest. So feel free to share that, as Leslie said, through that email process.
I just wanted to ask a question about this. Seems like it would largely be driven by weather, and I'm just wondering about days that providers, may, particularly day providers, may close for in-service training, which, was something we used to be able to do more of. We kind of lost more of that capacity in recent years, but just wondering about how those two things play into.
Yeah, so I'll start and then others can jump in if I'm misspeaking, but I believe the service adjustment analysis was initially just intended to account for those weather closures or unforeseen circumstances where the day habilitation services would be closing down. And if you're talking about in-service training, that might be the feedback we take to incorporate into that training component we specifically have, versus trying to make things more messy by trying to factor for too many things in this adjustment.
I'll just add, I think that's good feedback. That's the kind of thing that we're looking to get that information and be able to have those discussions with DDA about, what we want to do here, what we think is the most appropriate, and how do we accurately, and reasonably capture the information that's needed.
I know that this last part feels a little rushed, but as Chris had mentioned, we are more than open to any additional feedback if you want to send it to the RAG email. And then just was looking for initial reactions, but those are the three things we wanted to get back to you on, and what our steps have been in the interim of all the other things that we've been working on and discussing as well. So, there's a lot going on and a lot to digest. So not to rush anybody on their feedback. But if there aren't any other initial reactions, I'm going to turn it back over to the state to wrap up the meeting.
All right, thank you, Leslie. So I think the most important next step for us will be that we will let you know later today whether or not we'll be able to extend the deadline for feedback on the materials you saw today. In the meantime, we look forward to our next meeting on Thursday, May 18th from 12:30 to 2:30. Members of the public who would like to observe the meetings can register through the DDA training calendar at Constant Contact Events. Register once and get reminders for each meeting via GoToMeeting. Meeting connection links will be sent 1 day and 1 hour prior to the meeting, and meeting minutes will be made available following the meeting. If you have any questions regarding registration or would like to request accommodations, please contact Dr. Smalls. Let's go to the next slide, please. All right. You can see on this slide our remaining meeting dates for this review cycle. And all meeting materials will be made available through the designated DDA webpage for the advisory group. Thank you again for attending. We really do appreciate all of the feedback. I think, again, we've gotten a lot of things to think about as we continue to refine both the general ledger template for FY26 and going forward, and this additional data collection effort that we are undertaking to try to make some recommendations for FY25. So thank you again, everyone, and we will see you next month, and feel free to email feedback in the meantime to the RREG email address.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you.